I'd like to start by giving everybody a form of prayer. May God's peace and blessings be upon every single one of you. And welcome to tonight's discussion. And I think it's a very important topic. It's an important topic between believers, atheists, skeptics, and those in between. The discussion tonight will examine whether the belief in evolution disproves the existence of a creator, and how Darwin's theory of evolution is utilized, understood, and conveyed in contemporary society. The structure is going to be very simple. We're going to have approximately 20 minutes each from each of the speakers. Then there'll be a discussion between the speakers, followed by a question and answer session. Everyone is mature. Everyone is polite, everyone is tolerant, everyone is compassionate, everyone is a decent human being. We've all evolved to become, get the joke? No? All right. So basically, let me introduce our respected speakers. We have on my right, Professor Jeremy Pritchard. He's an active biologist and a senior lecturer in the School of Biosciences at the University of Birmingham. His research career started in Wales, and currently he focuses on aphids in Birmingham with stops in the USA, New Zealand, and Europe. He has published in many prominent journals, including the Journal of Experimental Biology, Global Change Biology, and Biotechnology Letters. His expertise is in how plants grow and are affected by changes in environment, the stress, including insect pests. His expertise is also in evolution and creationism, and he teaches in teaching and learning strategies at the school and university. He's a card-carrying Darwinist. I don't know what that means, maybe we'll find out today. And is involved in teaching evolution at all levels, from primary school to University of the Third Age. Please give him a warm welcome. Also to my right, we have Suboor Ahmed. He is a well-known public speaker and writer who has debated prominent academics on philosophy and science. He is currently pursuing postgraduate studies in philosophy and has a particular interest in the philosophy of biology and is specializing in this field. He is also the co-author of a forthcoming book called Failed Hypothesis: Essays on the Philosophy of Science, Atheism, Consciousness, Darwinism, and Islam. So, I don't know who's going first. I do apologize. Professor, if you don't mind, please, the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so nice to be here. Nice to talk to you about this. The question wasn't quite as specific as you just heard there. It was, as opposed to me, was does evolution undermine God? And in my philosophy, no, it doesn't. So, you know, we can all go home. Now, I have beliefs and not beliefs, and I have a view of the world. But I thought what would be useful is to briefly, if we're talking about the relationship between religion and science, I thought it would be useful to briefly give an overview of how I see science as coming to where it is now from, say, the ancient Greeks. Okay, because I think unpicking and understanding where we are now and how we look back helps us understand the type of question that you're posing tonight. So Darwin's great insight, from my view, is that he provides us with the so-called tree of life. He provides us with a coherent view of how organisms are related, how they've changed through time, and importantly, and people often overlook this, how all organisms are equal at the ends of the branches of these trees, of this tree. Before Darwin, people tended to think about organising the world, the living world, and then the inanimate world as a hierarchy. with some things higher than others and better than others. Darwin's theory, Darwin's ideas that we largely accept today, are a mechanism of biological change. Over the history of how we came to the position that we accept largely today, the history of this is not the history of how the mechanism developed, the ideas that Darwin had, but whether change had happened at all, biologically or even in the geological world. What I'm going to argue is, in fact, that the development of those ideas of change was dangerous to society, and that to some extent that was encapsulated in the relationship and the developing relationship, and to some extent the existing relationship between science and religion, science and God. So the Greeks, for example, would look at the world and see the world like we do, organisms all around them. They would see stones, beetles, worms, people, maybe even the gods. And they would organize them. They would see that there was, some things were simple, some things were complicated, and they would organize them into a hierarchy, like a ladder, with simple things at the bottom and complicated things at the top. Important thing about this ladder is that it's static. You can't move up it. Okay, so it's not like an escalator at New Street Station, although they're often static these days, as you may well know if you take the train through New Street. However, the important thing about this is this connected the living world. It was what we refer to as the Greeks referred to as the great chain of being. And it gives us an organisation. It means that things are not random, but it gives us some things that we carry through today, often in error. For example, that complex things are better, which isn't necessarily true. And it gives us this idea of progress, that we should strive to move upwards, even though this ladder does not move. So there's some concepts there that are subsequently picked up, particularly in Western medieval society. And in Western society at that time, in the medieval time, it was a feudal society, and you had all the money, all the power at the top of that hierarchy, with the slaves, the serfs, the workers at the bottom with very little money. It's in the interests of a society like that that nothing changes, because if things change, the people in power lose some of that power, that influence. And this, you can argue, is encapsulated in the Bible story, in the creation story, in Christian thought, in which the world is created in 6 days and then remains like that subsequently. Things are constant. Things do not change. Things are always as they have been, and to the people at the bottom of the pile, you will receive your reward in heaven. So change is dangerous. And if you want some evidence that is the case, of course, at this time, it was the burgeoning of the Islamic science golden age, and there were people working, like philosopher Al-Biruni, working on lots of things, very famous. In fact, he's got a crater named after him on the moon, dark side of the moon, so you have to go around the moon in a spacecraft to see it. But he was thinking about lots of things, including simple things, what we might recognize as simple, that rivers erode valleys and carry the silt down the mountain and deposit it in a delta at the bottom. Rivers change the environment gradually. Very simple idea. And through a convoluted series of, because of the library at Alexandria burning down, and the Moors and the Christians in southern Spain, the libraries in Granada and so on, these ideas came to be picked up in the West and developed, and they've been picked up, it's been used from the Greeks through Al-Biruni back to the West. And these were picked up in the 1200s by the Pope, and these were recognized as dangerous ideas because they were ideas about change. Very simple, we might think, and they were banned because the logical conclusion of that, if you follow it through, is change has happened, and that what it says in the Bible is not in fact true. So ideas of change are dangerous. In the West at that time, there was people studied nature, but they didn't study, and it's the basis of modern science, what they refer to as natural theology, that we study the living world to study the creation and therefore get to know God better. And in this we have people like Linnaeus, scientists like Linnaeus, who give us the definition of a species. They look at the world and they see that there are some things that are pigeons, there are some things that are eagles, there are some things that are donkeys, and they're different, they're definable, and they're always the same. And we can therefore give it a Latin name, Homo sapiens, whatever, because we can define that thing and it remains the same. So he gives us this idea that species are fixed, and he gives us clear species descriptions. So it well defines that word. And that is the framework into which natural theology, the study of the natural world, comes along. Indeed, it gives us even the idea of that we can natural theology can be used to almost argue for the existence of God. So the idea of the watchmaker argument, that if we look at a watch, we would deduce that a watchmaker had designed it because of its complexity and its function. And we can have the same, the natural theologists would argue the same about observing something complex like an eye that has clearly been apparently designed in order to see in a complex way, and the designer therefore is God. So intelligent design was one of the consequences of that. But we're not there at the moment. Now things have changed in the way that we view the world, and in a sense the seeds of that change were sowed in a way by Linnaeus, because by describing species very clearly, people started to be able to see that the world wasn't random, but that there were, if you looked at these species and organised them, some species were more similar to each other than others. So the eagle is more similar than it is to the pigeon than it is to the donkey. And so an organisation starts to emerge. And so what people start to say, well, why are some things more similar to each other than others? And one of the answers was descent with modification from a common ancestor. So there was a common ancestor, and then there were changes to this ancestor. There was a split. There were now two species, and so on down. So that diversity comes from descent with modification from a common ancestor. There was not a mechanism for that necessarily. It was just a description of a potential phenomena. And other things happened. Galileo removes the world from the centre of the perfect universe, the perfect spheres. The microscope sees new worlds in drops of water. Voyages of discovery to the other side of the world see organisms, animals not mentioned in the Bible, and so on. And within society, we started, particularly in Birmingham with the Lunar Society, we started to get ideas about change in society. The Lunar Society, a group of people used to meet in Birmingham, discuss ideas about change in machinery, ideas about change in society. Anti-slavery campaigners, for example, in the Lunar Society, which ties into Darwin's ideas about equality of organisms. Direct links there. But these ideas, again, were still seen as dangerous. So the Lunar Society, for example, some of the Lunar Society, their houses were attacked by mobs and they were burnt down in Handsworth because they were thinking about change. And people, particularly in England, saw change as dangerous because in France there was revolution going on, one of the most serious sorts of change. Change is dangerous. So at this point we had then a world in which either the world had been created and then things like volcanoes and earthquakes happened, catastrophes. And so the world was created but then pockmarked by these catastrophes. People could see volcanoes, people could see earthquakes. But then people were also picking up those ideas about gradual change, the sort of things that Al-Biruni had talked about, that gradual change happened, and we had a phenomena called uniformitarianism. in that the world that we see about it with the processes that operate in the world, in both the geological and potentially the biological world, are the same processes that have always operated. There is a consistency. There isn't this big bang and it's changed and then we wait for the next earthquake. Things change gradually over time. So I'm obviously skating very quickly over this, but once that change, particularly in the biological world, has been established as a fact, then you have to think as a scientist about, well, how does that work? We describe something and then what's the mechanism by which that change occurs? And there were lots of suggestions about this, and Darwin himself comes up with the theory that we now use as the baseline today, and it's very simple. Darwin noted that more individuals were produced by most organisms than can possibly survive, and so does a lot of them die. He noted that individuals are different from each other, that individuals vary. And he also noted that those variations are inherited. The key thing is that he suggested that the possession of a certain variation might allow you to survive rather than another one. So the chance of survival of those overproduced individuals is not a random process. It's a process, if you like, in inverted commas, of selection. Some of them are selected by the environment to survive and some aren't. So if it was cold and you had a set of organisms, some who randomly had furry coats and some of them who didn't, the ones with furry coats would survive because they can keep warmer. Their survival is not random. They just survive because they can keep warm because randomly they have a coat. So at the time Darwin was writing, the Victorians viewed the world as if you like, one view of it as a pastoral idyll. It was a beautiful place. Nature was lovely. We had lambs gambling in the field, trees, we had grass and waterfalls, birds singing. Beautiful place to be. A lot of the reaction to these mechanistic ideas about biological change come from a reaction against that. How can beauty be created by death and destruction? And so this is why you may be familiar with the phrase, but if not the poem, but the phrase "nature red in tooth and claw" by Tennyson. And it's essentially a diatribe, that's probably too strong a word, but a cry of despair from a man who feels that his religion has been taken away, that God has been taken out of the equation, because God has now been separated from the physical world. And it's interesting, actually, and I didn't realise this until quite late, because I thought Tennyson's poem and this cry, which reflected this debate that was going on in society at the time, I thought it was post-Darwin's publication. But Darwin published in 1859, but that poem by Tennyson was published in 1842. So it wasn't just Darwin who came up with this. These ideas had been developing and were current in people's thoughts for a while. So I think that the idea, just in that brief overview, and obviously it's loads of information, I think my colleague probably knows a lot more about it than I do, but I think it's interesting to see how we move from, or the development of science comes out of that natural theology, that religious view of the world. And there's a separation there, potentially, depends on how you want to live your life, what your philosophy is. And I think people like Thomas Aquinas, the Christian philosopher, actually articulated that quite well, that you can only come to know your God by a revelation, whereas you can't come to understand that through observation of the natural world. These two things were separated. And I have Christian friends that I speak to about this, and that is their view. That is their view of their world, that they study evolution, they're comfortable with the processes that we may talk about later, but their religion is a personal, internal thing, and their God is not physically in the world like that. Not my words, the words of other people. Anyway, I hope that is an interesting overview of where I see some of these ideas come from. Interested in people's thoughts and the follow-up. Thank you for listening.
I'm going to start as Muslims do. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. First, I'd like to thank Professor Jeremy Pritchard for taking part of this dialogue. And also, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, whoever doesn't thank the people does not thank God. So, alongside him, the Birmingham ISOC and also Beacons of Sanctity, and all of you tonight for attending. So we start in the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy. So I'm going to pretty much, of course, I'm going to agree with Professor Jeremy Pritchard here that Darwinian evolution does not undermine God, but maybe for different reasons which we can discuss. Now my case is the following. Darwinian evolution does not undermine God. Evolutionary biology works in a neutral framework, in a metaphysically neutral framework. What does that mean? That means they are dealing with real life problems which impact every single person in this room and every single person in the world, which is antibiotic resistance. They are not involved in trying to spread atheism. They're trying to stop the spread of bacteria. Greater goals. And when we actually speak about evolution, what are we actually referring to? Because evolution can mean many different things in many different contexts. So we're actually speaking about Darwinian evolution, which is the twin claim that all of life, bacteria, human beings, leopards, Lady Gaga, everything goes back to a single common ancestor. Alongside that, how did this change happen? How do we get from bacteria to elephants? How do we have a link between philosophers and primates? It's actually through the mechanism of natural selection. Now, I'm just going to be frank about my position. I believe Darwinian evolution to be a valid scientific model, theory, and paradigm. I do not believe intelligent design or creation science or anything like that is a valid scientific theory. Now, that's what this debate is. What this debate is actually about is about the PR problem that is associated with Darwinian evolution. Now, the problem is there is a difference between the public understanding, which some of us have, and the academic understanding. Now, the public understanding, this looks like a pretty much atheistic theory. For example, in the very popular book, Sapiens, written by the atheist biologist Yuval Noah Harari, this is what he says. There are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, and no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. Now, that is a statement written in a science book by a scientist, but clearly that's not a scientific statement. Or take the late evolutionary biologist and atheist philosopher Julian Huxley, not to be confused with T.H. Huxley, but he was his grandson. This is what he wrote in his book, Religion Without Revelation. This was published in 1927, a long time ago. But this particular statement, I believe, is very important for reasons which we might mention later on. It will soon be impossible for an intelligent, educated man or woman to believe in a God as it is now to believe that the earth is flat. So again, we have an evolutionary biologist writing for the public, and the statement obviously is not a scientific statement. And take the most popular atheist manual, if you like, or book that we have in the world, The God Delusion. The central argument of the God Delusion is based upon Darwinian evolution. And Richard Dawkins, he's a great writer, and one of his most, I think it's his best work, The Blind Watchmaker, which is actually what made him famous, he actually has this statement. Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually satisfied atheist. Now again, this is a book about science written by a scientist from Oxford, but it is not exactly a scientific statement. And why this is important is because this is the view that I'm going to be challenging today. I do not think this is a view which is even shared by Darwin. because Darwin was never an intellectually satisfied atheist. In fact, Darwin said, "It seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist." Now, Darwin had a very complex sort of relationship with God. And we need to take into account the words of John Headley from Oxford University, a professor of science and religion there. We should be careful about pigeonholing a man who wouldn't pigeonhole pigeons. So I'm just going to be pigeonholing him for sake of brevity, but we can go into details about why he went through those transitional changes later. He first off started off as a Christian. Now, as a Christian, he actually wanted to, at one point, as Professor Pritchard knows, or he may have briefly spoken about, he actually wanted to become a priest. Later on, he became a deist. Now, what is a deist? A deist is somebody who believes in God but does not believe in religion. He just believes in God. Later on in life, he became an agnostic because of the problem of evil. So nothing to do with science. What's really interesting is Darwin actually said, "In my most extreme fluctuations, I have never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of God." In fact, this is a very interesting incident. When a reviewer wrote a review about Darwin's book, Origin of Species, and he said, "This conception that the creator makes the initial creation, which then evolves naturally into all the forms of life that we have today, is just as noble of a thing for God to do as for God to create every species individually." Darwin was so impressed by these words, he actually included it in his second edition of The Origin of Species. So clearly, he was not an intellectually satisfied atheist, and I don't think he would agree with this sort of taking his theory and making it into an atheistic type of theory. In fact, he explicitly wrote, and this is in a book, a very important book, I think, written by Nick Spencer, Darwin and God. Darwin particularly wrote, "I had no intention of writing atheistically." Now, I believe Darwin is correct, and the popularizers, like Richard Dawkins and Julian Huxley and others, are incorrect in regards to theology in terms of undermining evolution, undermining the existence of God, because of the conflation of two types of naturalism. There is methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism. Now, methodological naturalism is very, very simple. We're all scientists. We walk into this science room, and we all have a working assumption. Whenever we look at nature, we're going to use natural effects being explained by natural causes. Very simple thing. So we're not going to refer to an immaterial mind, the soul, God, anything like that. The second type of naturalism is philosophical naturalism, which is, outside of this room, as a belief system, we only believe that nature exists and there is no God, there is no soul, there is no objective morals or anything like that. Obviously, these are two different things. One is a working assumption in science, and two, philosophical naturalism is actually a belief. Now, methodological naturalism is actually very controversial. Well, it's not controversial. It's been made to appear controversial. But this is the very reason why I mentioned earlier that I do not believe intelligent design as a theory to be science, because it's not in line with methodological naturalism. Now, what Elliot Sober, an atheist prominent philosopher of biology, what he explains about this particular conflation is this. Evolutionary theory is neutral in regards to the second definition of naturalism, which is philosophical naturalism. It only adopts the first. He also has a very important statement about this. The theory of evolution does not rule out deism, the thesis that God starts the universe in motion and forever after declines to intervene. But the theory does not also rule out a more active God whose intervention into nature fly under the radar of evolutionary biology. So this is very important to understand. Whenever a scientist is working within his field, a reference to God or anything metaphysical is something that they obviously cannot do. And Scott Todd he's another evolutionary biologist, and he explains this, and I think in a bit more clearer terms. Even if all the data points to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. So that's methodological naturalism. Of course, the scientist as an individual is free to embrace a reality that transcends naturalism. So just to give you a brief example, Darwin was against slavery. He actually hated slavery. He considered it one of the great evils. Now, obviously, that is not something which is based on science. That is his philosophy. That is a view that he holds that's nothing to do with methodological naturalism. Because from a methodological naturalism point of view, evolution has made us be moral purely as a collective fiction to help us survive. Now, obviously, you can have moral views outside of holding methodological naturalistic views. Now, the idea that evolution undermines God, that's obviously been cleared. But what I want to do in my last couple of minutes is focus upon, I think, a more important question, which is, does evolution undermine the Abrahamic God? Because obviously, as we mentioned earlier, it doesn't undermine the deistic concept of God. It doesn't undermine the theistic concept of God. But does it undermine the Abrahamic conception of God? And the answer is very simple. Yes and no. It's yes if somebody has a misunderstanding about what science can achieve. And if somebody thinks that science gives us absolute results which do not change. No, if they have an academic understanding of science, if they actually understand the philosophy of science, which is that science gives us working models about the world, which are then replaced by other models, and science has a working assumption of methodological naturalism, and it also has many other multiple assumptions in the theories that it actually proposes. This is explained well in Philosophy of Science, a New Introduction by Oxford University. This is all mainstream stuff by the philosopher Gillian Barker and Philip Kitcher. Science is revisable, hence to talk of scientific proof is dangerous, because the term fosters the idea of conclusions that are graven in stone. So whether you, I'm going to use some complicated language, I can explain a bit later, whether you hold a view of scientific realism or what's known as scientific anti-realism, both camps, and this is a pretty much consensus in the philosophy of science, that science doesn't give you absolute results which are written in stone. Theories can be revised, theories can be changed, and if you look at the history of science, if we look at chemistry, physics, and biology, we have this constant evolution, we have this constant change, like the professor was highlighting. This is even highlighted by the Oxford professor Richard Dawkins in his book, A Devil's Chaplain. We must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. Now, it's the first time I mentioned the word Darwinism, so we need to separate out some things. Evolution simply means biological change over time, and Darwin proposed the idea of universal common ancestry along with natural selection being the main driving force. But as the professor pointed out, the idea of common ancestry or universal common ancestry was known before Darwin. In fact, Professor Monier Williams from Oxford University, a professor of Sanskrit at the time of Darwin, he actually said the ancient Hindus were Darwinists 3,000 years before Darwin. So the idea of universal common ancestry goes back obviously before, but Darwin proposed the actual mechanism, which is sometimes referred to as Darwinism, sometimes referred to as neo-Darwinism. So we should not neglect the philosophy of biology and the philosophy of science when we are trying to understand these issues. So Darwinian evolution does not undermine theism, deism, or even the Abrahamic God. You can be somebody who believes, and I actually know of Muslims who are working within the field of evolutionary biology. They're working with the Quranic paradigm, which is that if you save a life, you save the lives of all. When evolutionary biologists are working across the world, they're trying to save lives. They're not involved in these sort of theological disputes. So you can say, yes, common ancestry in some aspects in terms of the tree of life, not all obviously, but in some aspects may conflict with my personal belief, but I can accept it as a valid scientific model and contribute to this field. Now, Darwinian evolution, according to a mainstream understanding of the philosophy of biology, is a framework which is based on a probabilistic framework which has assumptions, and they are valid disputes at a conceptual and a scientific level. Now, philosopher of biology, Elliot Sober, he explains this in his book Evidence and Evolution, published by Cambridge University, again a mainstream textbook on this issue, the philosophy of biology, and he explains the tree of life is based on a probabilistic framework. So like the professor was mentioning earlier, things which look similar There's the assumption that they have a common ancestor, which is known as homology, but that assumption of homology is something which has not a rival, but there's a complexity in there. There is a challenge in there, which is homoplasy, that we have similarities at a biochemical level, at a genetic level, at an anatomical level, at a linguistic level, even at a psychological level, which are not due to common ancestry. So what he says in regards to this is, both of the following thoughts are therefore naive. Humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they're so similar, and humans and mushrooms must have arisen independently because they are so different. There is no must within a probabilistic framework. Now, not to take his words out of context, he does believe in human-chimp ancestry, and he does believe it to be true in the literal sense. What he's saying here is, from a scientific point of view, from a philosophy or biology point of view, what science can lead you to is it's based on a probabilistic framework. There are also assumptions within the theory. It is based upon the assumption of gradualism, and also that natural selection is the main mechanism, but obviously there are other things at play, like genetic drift, and that mutations are random. There was a conference in 2016 in November with the Royal Society members, where they came together, the oldest and the most prestigious society in the world. And the central question that they were discussing was Darwin right in terms of natural selection? Now, some of the biologists were saying, yes, he is. Some of them were saying no. Right now, as it stands, I would say the vast majority of biologists across the world believe Darwinian evolution is the correct mechanism. The reason why I'm highlighting these changes and these differences is to show that that's just the way that science actually works. And till today, we still have biologists like Masatoshi Nai and like Eva Jablanka who are trying to put forth mechanisms which they believe are alternative to Darwin, such as neo-mutationism and neo-Lamarckism. Now, I am not endorsing any of them. I am only highlighting that they exist. This is to show that that's the way that science actually works. Now, the view that somebody can actually hold, as I mentioned earlier, is the view that you can accept Darwinian evolution to be a working model theory paradigm. You can accept that this particular theory is based on a probabilistic framework which has assumptions, and there's disputes at a conceptual and a scientific level. But you can accept it as the best thing that we have currently in science, but not to be absolutely true. So you don't have to accept it theologically. Now, the late atheist philosopher of science, David Stove, he was an atheist, an eminent philosopher. In his book, Darwinian Fairy Tales, he was a critic of Darwinian evolution, but he mentioned something which I think we can agree with, whether we agree with Darwin or we don't. Darwin's explanation of evolution, even though it is still the best one available, is not true. So what's he basically saying here? Like I mentioned previously, there's two particular ideas here. There's universal common ancestry, which is pre-Darwinian, but Darwin also endorsed it, and there's the Darwinian mechanism. So he's referring to the Darwinian mechanism. He thinks it's the best one available, but it is not true in the absolute sense. So just to summarize, evolution does not undermine God. This is based on a conflation of two types of naturalism, methodological and philosophical naturalism. Evolution does not undermine a deistic concept of God, a theistic concept of God, and nor does it undermine an Abrahamic concept of God. This is based on the misunderstanding that science gives absolute truth. Science is based upon what is known as the problem, is based upon induction, where you take a set of observations and you make a general conclusion. Now, you can always have a new data which can challenge your previous data. And you can always have a new interpretation which can challenge your previous interpretation. So the problem of induction is a reason why science can never give you absolutely certain results which never change. In fact, there was an interesting discussion with the philosopher Stephen Law and Richard Dawkins, which you can watch on YouTube. And a questioner asked Richard Dawkins, how can we be certain in science when it's based upon induction? And he said, well, science works. The problem with that is induction. So you can't use induction to prove induction. That's circular reasoning. David Hume, who highlighted the problem of induction, still took science as a working model. We still have the problem of induction in science today, But it doesn't mean we throw out the baby with the bathwater. We go where the science leads us, but we don't have to accept the results are absolutely certain. Now, what I'd like to end upon is a statement of Darwin from, like I mentioned earlier, the book by Nick Spencer, Darwin and God. Now, Darwin had a very complex relationship with God, and he had some very interesting philosophical ideas about free will and predestination and so on and so forth. But there's one aspect which I really wanted to highlight, because when I read this in that book, I just thought, okay, I can resonate with Darwin here, because this is a type of awe when a person looks into nature. As God says in the Quran, in the creation of the heavens and the earth and the alternation of night and day, there are signs for those with intelligence. So when someone looks into nature, it should be something which brings them closer to God. So Darwin said a statement which I really felt close to. I cannot persuade myself that electricity acts, that the tree grows, that man aspires to the loftiest conceptions, all from blind brute force. Everything good I have said is from God. Every mistake is my own. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters and friends, I learned a lot. I've been writing notes. I learned a lot from Professor. Learned a lot from Brother Saboor. Thank you for that. So now is the time for us to have a brief discussion. I'm going to slightly move my check. I don't have a check. My chair rather backwards. And if you could just slightly turn here, Professor. So I think the way to start this off is with a question from yourself, Professor, to Suboor, and just have a discussion. And if there's any swords drawn, I'm in the middle. So I'm going to be a silent spectator for now. So, Professor.
I agree with most of what you say. I mean, I can't think of anything specifically I don't. I think the ideas about Darwin that you talk about are right. I mean, I think he didn't want to be a clergyman. I think he was part of a society in which the people of that class had to look for I think he studied medicine in Edinburgh and couldn't stand the sight of blood. And when his father found out that he wasn't going to be a doctor anymore, he pulled his money and brought him home. And for somebody of his class, I think being a cleric was the next thing. He could go shooting and collect beetles, which was one of his things. And so he did actually qualify, I think, as a religion. But just before he had to go back to Shrewsbury and find a church, he managed to get himself a berth on the Beagle, and the whole course of his life changed. So, I mean, but no, I mean, I haven't got any specific rapier-like questions that you need to defend against.
I mean, just a discussion.
But so no, I mean, I admire Darwin for being a scientist and being somebody who. I did some work and putting together an idea about these ideas of how change came about, and I'm quite fascinated by the ideas that these ideas of change are dangerous and they influence the way we interpret these things now. But I tried to trace it through and look at people writing about this stuff and through the 1700s and looking at where did Darwin's ideas actually come from, and they are. You may disagree, but I can't see anywhere where they're parts of a sequence. He seems to have had that insight himself, building on the stuff of others, but he builds something new from what was lying around. And this idea that before, even Lamarck, for example, talked about hierarchies and ladders and things. He made the ladder move, but he's still got a hierarchy. And I think so Darwin does come up with this new stuff with the tree, and I like the idea that you talked about slavery. That was very important to Darwin, and there are some new biographies about him where that's a driver. That idea of equality. If you look in The Origin of Species, the only picture is that of a tree, but it's not a tree like we would have with the branches all around. It's flat, and I think that's deliberate. That everything on the end of those branches is equal, because at Darwin's time there were philosophies around that there were 27 different species of human, which of course was promulgated by the West as part of the dominance, imperialism. Exactly.
I mean, it's interesting you're speaking about Darwin's belief. His not disbelief, because he never became an atheist, but his doubts about God started with the death of his basically daughter, right? And also his son passed away 2 days before he actually gave his paper to like the Royal Society. And what's really interesting is that throughout near the end of his life, he became an agnostic because of the problem of evil, but he was constantly going back and forth. And what's interesting is that Elliot Sober writes about him that he's a methodological naturalist. So he said, okay, that's like nature. I can't like, I'm not going to assume that God intervenes. But he was never settled with the idea that this is all purposeless, that there's the universe is all the product of some sort of blind brute force, right? What I'm really interested in is why he became a beacon for the sort of secular atheistic sort of crusade against religion and Christianity in particular. And today, when you mention Darwin's personal beliefs, people are very surprised. They're like, okay, so he's no longer, you know, pigeonholed as the head of this sort of movement. And when I read works like, well, if you consider it works, The God Delusion, and you just find Darwin so prominent in there. And I think Darwin would not be happy with that, with his name being used in such a manner.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think Darwin has become this cipher that we defend, and you know, you can't say that because Darwin said it in an almost, you know, religious fervour sort of way. It's worth remembering Darwin was wrong about a lot of things. The 6th edition of The Origin of Species, actually Darwin was, which is the last one that Darwin contributed to, Darwin was searching for a mechanism. Because you mentioned neo-Darwinism, which is the synthesis of modern genetics with Darwin's ideas about differential survival. He didn't really like the phrase natural selection because it implied a selector, whereas it's actually life or death depending on the environment. And Darwin was looking for a mechanism by which this variation is inherited. And Lamarck's ideas, which were obviously wrong, about inheritance of acquired characteristics, the classic thing of a giraffe stretching its neck to reach some leaves and therefore then having an offspring with a longer neck, had been disproved before. If you cut the tail off a mouse, it doesn't have a baby with no tail. If you lose your finger, you don't have children with no fingers. So this inheritance of acquired characteristic isn't true. But Darwin came up with an idea and it's called germules and pangenesis. And it's in The Origin of Species.
It's been disproven.
Yeah, and although it's interesting, I used to think that, and I still do broadly, but I set my first year students an essay called Is Epigenetics the New Lamarckism?
Yeah.
Because there is therefore, those of you who know about genetics, that your genes could be switched on or off because it's cold or warm and it helps you adapt to the environment. And people are now finding out that some organisms, their offspring, be they plants or people, have an altered, those genes are still switched off. So the environment, they've acquired a characteristic because of the environment, and then they pass that on to their offspring. And by some definitions, that's Lamarckism. Yeah. Of course, it doesn't cascade down the generations in the same way, and it doesn't change the genetic code.
Well, it's definitely not progressive, because that's one of the ideas of Lamarck, which we don't have evidence for that. Things are getting more, and complexity is obviously confusing. But what's really interesting is when it comes to actually Lamarck's ideas and you know the way he was ridiculed for almost 200 years. But if you read Darwin actually flirts with the idea of acquired characteristics.
He's finding it difficult to understand the inheritance process because there was no mechanism. At the time Darwin was writing, Mendel had done his genetics, so the genetics was there, but nobody had realised the significance, partly because Mendel was talking about round and wrinkly peas, so you were either this or you were this, whereas as you said in your presentation, we're talking about gradualism, and that you can't be a little bit more wrinkly, and so the genetics was wrong. It was qualitative changes rather than quantitative changes, and it wasn't until later that we came to understand that genes can have many effects and many genes can have single effects. You know, so many genes affect your height, for example. You wouldn't be this tall or this tall. There's a whole gradation. And when that came, people realised in the 20s and 30s that was could be combined with that was the mechanism. Then we get the neo-Darwinism that is, as you say, the paradigm today.
Yeah. What's, I think, very important for people to take away as well is the distinction between methodological and philosophical naturalism. Because that is, I think, central to the whole confusion between science undermining God, Darwinian evolution undermining God. And this is why I think it's very important to bring in philosophy of science within science. This will narrow the gap, as you know, between the popular understanding and the academic understanding. And also that it'll help people to appreciate that there's different ways of looking at the world. It's not just, let me just put on these lenses of science, right? There's other ways of actually acquiring a truth. I remember a few years ago, I had a conversation with someone, and I said, do you believe in God? And he said, I believe in science. He said it in a very religious way. But, can science pay your bills? Can science tell you what's right and wrong? Can science tell you if Plato existed? That's testimony. So there's many different routes of knowledge, and I think this is why science has done so many great things in our contemporary society that, we just put all our eggs in that one basket. So how do you see that sort of playing out in the next couple of years in the way people think?
Well, I think the key point is the one that you made when you spoke about uncertainty and science and proof. We can never prove anything in science because we work with statistics, we work with probability. So, and that's why scientists don't come over very well on the radio when they're against a politician. And you say, well, if I eat this food, will it give me cancer? And somebody might say, yes, it does, because it happened to my child. And the scientist will say, well, and the interviewer will say, well, does it cause cancer? Well, it might do, and it might be 1 in 100 chance. So you can't say it doesn't. And I think that understanding of science as a way of dealing with uncertainty and trying to, in a way, science is a way of understanding how uncertain we are in something that we observe, and that's how we organise the world. I think the interesting, and we haven't really touched on some of these ideas, but I mean, you mentioned a bit about morality, for example. So as an evolutionist, I would want to be able to what we call reverse engineer any characteristic. Okay, so you would say, and I don't like using the word why in an evolutionary context. I try and persuade people that evolutionists should be saying, how does something improve the fitness of an organism? What is the selective advantage of that? Not why does a bird have wings, right? But we use it as shorthand. Why is a philosophical question. Yeah. But why does a bird have wings? He says, having explained himself. A bird has wings because if it has wings, it can fly away and not be eaten, and the genes for having wings will be maintained in the population. That's a reverse engineering idea that sets up a hypothesis. But we can also set up, we can reverse engineer anything. It doesn't mean that thing has a function. So you could say, what's the point of a chin? Right, well, see that is, but what is the function of a chin? Well, it might have no function. You could think of a function. You could probably ask you all, and you could come up with different ideas. It sets up but a chin may be just the result of development and the way our teeth are and how our jaw has to be. So not everything, as you said, has to have an evolutionary explanation.
I mean, we also have, Stephen Jay Gould wrote about this extensively. We have these so-called maladaptations, that we have this evolutionary byproducts, and the chin may be a byproduct of this or whatever the actual hypothesis is. But this is why it gets very dangerous when someone takes scientific ideas and then tries to understand morality through them. Like the philosopher Michael Roos, he says about morality that this is an illusion created by the genes. Now, this is actually quite dangerous territory, because imagine telling a 15-year-old, in the inner city Birmingham, that your morality is the illusion of your genes. I mean, that is not going to go down too well. Yeah. So we should be careful about what science, to take its conclusions and then use that as a sort of acid to burn away theological ideas. Yeah. Because there's many different ways of looking at the world. Yeah. And I think it's very, very important to separate those out. And one thing that we should try and do as educators, as people who want to narrow the gap between the public and the academic understanding, is get people to start reading, because we just listen all the time. You hear someone say, I mean, how many times have you heard, this is a gene for X? but you'll never find a credible scientific journal saying, okay, that is the gene for, bad behavior. So we need to educate ourselves in that, and we need to understand that for us to actually, just to benefit from science is not enough. If we really do want to be grateful to science, then we should understand how it works, and also the philosophy side of it, and what the philosophers actually say about what it is based upon, what it can achieve and what it can't actually achieve.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, I think it's an interesting discussion to have about morality and free will, as you touched on, because our brains give us a much more nuanced view of the world, and we have a view of the future. We have a view of the self of ourselves. We have empathy, which most organisms don't have, and it's important for society and our previous evolution in groups and to be successful in the environment which we came through as a group, where we could share tasks. But that also gives us a responsibility and an opportunity. And if there was a gene that meant that you didn't have empathy, and there are people who lack empathy, psychopaths, and there may well be a genetic basis to that. It isn't a single gene; it will be like your height, a combination of genes. But does that make that person evil or not evil? Because it's not their fault, and that is a moral, and that is also a legal distinction. If you have a gene that makes you do something and you kill somebody, are you guilty of murder, or is it not your fault because of your genetics? And that because of where we are in our evolutionary trajectory, in a way it's a curse, it's a responsibility, because you have to develop a philosophical moral view that takes that biology into account, because we are more complicated.
Not only that, I mean, that's very interesting insight, but also that when they are scientific ideas, those scientific ideas have a basis. And that basis, if you give someone that scientific idea without giving them that actual basis, then they can use those to actually run away and come up with conclusions which don't make any sense. Like when the famous Selfish Gene book came out, some people misinterpreted that as a type of vindication of morality, right? It was like, okay, we can be selfish, greed is good. But anybody who understands the philosophy side of things will understand, okay, wait, hang on a second, that's based on the idea of the selfish gene, which is that the gene is the unit of selection, and that basically that's just a model that we have within population genetics, and you cannot get a ought from an is. That's the naturalistic fallacy. People don't get that. People don't get what it's based upon, what the framework is, what you can't do and what you can do. You just get we even have this joke in the office sometimes when someone's doing something very selfish, we say, oh, it's the selfish gene, right? And that's why it's very, very important. It's very, very important to have these sort of discussions where people from a background of science and philosophy can come together and say, okay, let's try and mitigate the difference between the public and the academic understanding.
I mean, the idea of altruism is something that was a big problem in the development of evolutionary theory, because, as you say, you get your genes through to the next generation is the objective of evolution, if I can give it a face. But we see altruistic behavior where an organism might sacrifice itself or spend energy that it could have spent on itself helping somebody else to reproduce, right? So, I mean, a bird might, it's been observed that if birds are bringing up fledglings in a nest, that another bird might help them. Why would that bird help them when it could go away and have its own nest and get its own genes through to the next generation? So it looks like altruistic, non-selfish behavior. But of course, the reason is that bird is related to the other birds. And while it might not be in a position to have a nest itself, maybe it was too late, didn't get enough food or a nesting site, by helping its parents have more success with its own eggs, it's getting more of its own genes through to the next generation, even if they're not in the bird itself. And I think that's something of the selfish gene. But just about the selfish gene, though, you say the gene's the unit of selection. One of the things that Dawkins gets wrong there is the gene isn't the obvious selection, because the consequences of all the genes working together to make a body, that's what the environment sees with a woolly coat or not a woolly coat, and that's what lives or dies, not the individual gene.
Yeah, and this is also very important because the selfish gene idea was W.G. Hamilton. He popularized it, and it's been dominating evolutionary biology for decades. And when E.O. Wilson's book came out, The Social Conquest of Earth, and he challenged that with his alternative group selection, there was a big online spat, which I'm sure you're aware of, with Richard Dawkins and Elliot Wilson. So they're having this sort of dispute. And I'm only sort of interested in the sort of philosophy side of things here. So we're having a shift, according to some, in evolutionary biology about the unit of selection. Is it selfish, or is it the gene, or is it group? Now, what's interesting is that when they were going back and forth, so Richard Dawkins obviously is very upset. You have the selfish gene idea, and he's got the social conquest of the earth, group selection idea. When they're going back and forth online, this is when a philosopher can watch, okay, what's going on? So there's two scientists having this sort of debate, and the interesting thing about the debate was it was about not accepting a paradigm change, because that's sometimes hard for scientists to do when they're stuck within a paradigm. They're looking at the world throughout that paradigm. Now, E.O. Wilson got very upset because of Richard Dawkins challenging him on that particular issue, and Richard Dawkins says, you shouldn't read his book, and E.O. Wilson replied back saying, well, if science worked in this particular way, where, it was all about votes, right? Because, Dawkins got all these people saying, these are the people who actually support me. He said, we would still be burning things, believing in phlogiston, and using geocentric maps. So sometimes scientists and credible scientists can get involved in discussions because they get stuck within a paradigm. And Thomas Kuhn wrote a very important book about the scientific structure of revolutions, is that sometimes scientists can get involved in what's known as normal science. So they're getting involved in this process, and they're looking at the world through a paradigm, and then when a new paradigm comes, like say Darwinian evolution as a mechanism is being challenged by Neo-Lamarckian evolution, or Masatoshi Nai's neo-mutationism, or evolution by by genetic engineering, by I've forgotten his name. So any of those paradigms, it's actually, according to Thomas Kuhn, a almost impossible religious experience, right? To change from one paradigm to another, because it's been working so well. And we saw this at the beginning of the 20th century with quantum theory and classical mechanics, Newtonian mechanics, that some of the scientists just did not want to accept.
And plate tectonics.
So I will have a really good note to end. I think it was an amazing discussion. These are the type of discussions that we all should be having, especially on campus. And I'd like to thank Professor Pritchard and Suboor Ahmed for being very polite and courteous. And it was an amazing discussion. I've learned a lot. Thank you very much for your time. We're slightly over time. I do apologize, but I think they both deserve another round of applause. So have a great evening. Thank you for coming.